All right, welcome everybody to episode 26 of the podcast, where we will be discussing the past, present, and future of one of science fiction's most prolific subgenres, cyberpunk. I absolutely adore cyberpunk, and stylistically, thematically, atmospherically, it's one of my favorite genres to consume, whether it's movies, TV, books, that kind of thing. From Blade Runner and Ghost in the Shell to Akira, Neuromancer, The Matrix, and more, cyberpunk is a staple of the sci-fi canon, but I'm really curious, and this is what kind of sparked this discussion, my decision to do this is, where is the genre headed and how does that speak about where cyberpunk came from? And today I'm joined by an amazing panel of guest authors, all making their first appearances on the show to help decipher these questions with me. And first up is Malka Older. She's an author, worker, and aid worker and sociologist. Wrote the Centenal Cycle, including Infomocracy, Null States, and State Tectonics. And she also created the fiction serial Ninth Step Station, wrote the short story collection And Other Disasters, and has written opinion pieces for the New York Times, The Nation, and more. So welcome to the show, Malka. How are you?
Thanks. It's great to be here. Great topic.
Thank you for being here. And also with us is T.R. Napper, the doctor of cyberpunk. He's a former aid worker, so shout out to the aid workers here today. And now he is an author, having published the novel 36 Streets and the short story collection Neon Leviathan. He also wrote his doctorate thesis in creative writing on The Dark Century, 1946 to 2046, Noir, Cyberpunk, and Asian Modernity. So I'm really excited to get your opinions on all this. Glad to have you here, Tim. How are you?
Thank you. I'm a bit disappointed I have to speak so intelligently, but other than that, I'm very happy to be here.
You can handle yourself. I know you can. Don't worry about it.
We'll see.
And next up is Lincoln Michel, a short story writer, novelist, teacher, and editor. His short fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House Noon, and more, and his essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Vice, among others. He's also edited the anthologies Tiny Nightmares and Tiny Crimes, as well as penned the novel The Body Scout and the short story collection Upright Beasts. Thank you for being with us today, Lincoln. How's it going?
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. And finally, Craig Lee Gordon, author of Arvect, Hypercage, Obey Defy, The Acid Suite books, and more. He was also forever changed by a rental copy of RoboCop when he was 12, a defining moment that I'm sure influenced him to become a cyberpunk author. And I'm very excited to hear your opinions on everything, but very happy to have you here, Craig, and welcome to SFF Addicts.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, happy to. And to kick off the discussion, I wanted to know, what is everyone's personal history with the cyberpunk genre? You know, what are some of the earliest stories or films or shows that you remember coming across, and what impression did that leave on you? So I will start with you, Lincoln.
Well, I don't think I have a super surprising answer to this. I think probably Blade Runner was the first movie I saw in that kind of genre, and probably Neuromancer, or, if we're counting Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, were like the first books I read. But I was definitely drawn to it pretty early on, especially as someone who really grew up with, like, in the punk rock scene. So, like, I kind of came to it from the punk side of the cyberpunk.
From the early days. Nice.
Well, I'm not that old. I'm not but I just mean that, I really like the kind of punk ethos of at least those early cyberpunk books. I mean, maybe later we'll talk about whether the punk label is still appropriate or not. But I was primed to love a genre that was about how corporate dystopia was destroying the world, because that seemed like what I was already headbanging to.
That was your vibe at the time. Yeah. I love that. And Malka, what about you?
Yeah, now I'm trying to remember, like, whether I first encountered Neuromancer or Blade Runner, or what order I read them in. Definitely Snow Crash was like a very big influence for me. And yeah, now I'm not sure actually if I read that and then went to Gibson, or had read Gibson first. But also I recently rewatched Sneakers, which is kind of
a,
nice.
right? Kind of a Hollywoodification. Like, it holds up really well in some ways and much less well in others. But it really is an interesting, maybe, reflection of the genre more than installment, because it is a little bit of a remove, but it's really a fun movie.
Yeah, I haven't seen Sneakers in forever, but that is a deep cut.
Mm-hmm.
And Tim, what about you?
Yeah, I don't think my entry point to Cyberpunk is particularly original. I think it started. I was kind of obsessed with Philip K. Dick when I was quite young. You could call him proto-cyberpunk, I suppose. But that was maybe the starting point. Blade Runner blew me away. It was so transportative, and still holds up 40 years later, I suppose, now. And the other one was Ghost in the Shell. I think the Ghost in the Shell embodies some of the really important thematic concerns I think Cyberpunk has. So those three, I was trying to think of something original when everyone else was talking, but I really think it was those three was the starting point of it all. If we're talking about when we started in Cyberpunk, yeah.
Nice. And Craig, what was your first introduction to it?
Yeah, I mean, you've already called that out really, which was RoboCop. So I was homesick one day off school and asked my mum to get me a couple of videos from the video shop. And I mean, it was a bit different back then, but I basically asked for RoboCop and colors. So she came back with both of those. And so RoboCop was definitely my first sort of foray into Cyberpunk. And then in the UK, Channel 4 had a long running sort of series where they showed loads of anime, and like everyone else, that was pretty much, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, and also Cyber City Oedo 808.
Nice.
And then, growing up again, just like obviously RoboCop, Total Recall, Terminator, just all of that sort of stuff really, and all just kind of fused together. Always loved sci-fi anyway, but just after seeing all of that sort of media, it just really, really kind of honed me in. And, Cyberpunk is pretty much what I love watching, what I love writing.
It's interesting
Awesome.
that when we talk about our influences, that we're largely talking about film. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because when people say, hey, Cyberpunk's a big thing now, there's people are into Cyberpunk, I often wonder about how much of it is in video games and film, and how much we've been influenced by a medium that's so aesthetically gorgeous. And that I think Snow Crash was named and Neuromancer was named, but we didn't, and Philip K. Dick, but we really didn't talk about many books. And I do wonder, compared to other subgenres, how much of this, the influence of this, is purely from film,
Yeah, because it's such an aesthetically visual genre, because there's so much distinction of like the neon, the rain, the kind of stuff that Blade Runner really laid the foundation for.
And I think that's one of the reasons it's quite hard to write and very easy to write badly, because because you can get caught up in the visuals, and I think you can sometimes miss some of the thematic elements of Cyberpunk.
Very true. Lincoln, you were going to say something?
Oh, just bringing up, I think you're quite right about the influence of video games, especially for like younger people today. But that made me think of maybe my first introduction to Cyberpunk was the video game series Syndicate and Syndicate Wars.
Ooh,
yeah,
man.
You play these assassins going around for corporations to kidnap scientists.
Yeah.
Man, I haven't heard about that one in a long time. But this kind of lays the foundation for something that I think is really interesting. Like for you personally, each of you, what attracts you to the genre? Lincoln, I'll start with you.
Well, I think, there is a lot of interest in the visuals and stuff. But for me, as a fiction writer, I do think the themes are what draw the themes and the kind of style and atmosphere of it. And so I think, that is like an interesting comment about how much of it comes from film. And I think that's true. But I also think probably I'm not unique in also combining in my mind, like the noir elements of noir books I love, like Raymond Chandler and stuff, and then the science fiction elements of science fiction that's critical of capitalism and corporatism and all of that. And again, I mean, a million writers have done this. But I think when I'm thinking of my influences writing, a lot of it was like, oh, I love Philip K. Dick and I love Raymond Chandler. How do I put those together? So maybe more than like, how do I follow in the footsteps of Snow Crash?
Yeah, it's like, how do I take the weirdness of Philip K. Dick and the technological sort of like absurdities that he plays with, and the ideas of the mind and the body and consciousness and reality, and then blending that with, the hard-boiled sort of foundation, which we will get into in a little bit. But Malka, go ahead, Lincoln. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to name drop Margaret Atwood's Madame trilogy was also another. It's like series that was very big for me, but I wouldn't call it cyberpunk itself. But I was like, oh, I could,
Yeah, more like, I don't know. I hate the term, but cli-fi, climate fiction kind of thing. But Malka, what's what attracts you to cyberpunk?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question because I'm now suddenly known as like a post-cyberpunk author when I actually have written and thought about different things, but that's sort of the one that works. And so I was thinking back to like why I started writing that novel with a very cyberpunk approach. And I think that the early cyberpunk, there was so much cool about it. And it was, there was that aesthetic you mentioned from the movies, but I think it went way on that in terms of like just sort of technological conundrums and imagine tech that looked very cool. Molly's mirror shades and I don't know, so many examples. I was also thinking when you mentioned video games of Shadowrun as like something that I remember a friend had and was like, how it was sort of different problems and different a whole different sort of setting. And so that newness, that feeling of newness. And then, I think aesthetic kind of came, the ideas at that time of what new and edgy looked like. And then it kind of just trailed into to staying that way, even as new and edgy evolved. So yeah, I think a lot of that sense of newness, the sense of kind of pushing out on the boundaries of technology, combined with those larger themes of like really questioning who's in control of technology and what is technology doing to us and so on.
Yeah, completely agree. And Craig, you mentioned your influences, but what is it that really attracts you about the genre?
I think it's the use of the technology, really. Like I've always just loved technology and futurism, and even for music, that's what always drew me towards techno, because it was always purported to be, the sound of the future. And then there's a couple of specific themes that I kind of keep going back to when I'm rewatching films or with my own work, and that's just things like transhumanism, perceptions of reality, and the singularity as well. Like I think those three for me are the key kind of themes and sort of concepts which draw me towards cyberpunk. As I said, watching things like Total Recall, perceptions of reality there, and your memories, and you've got the memories aspect of Blade Runner, and then also the Matrix, perception of reality there, and even things like Strange Days. And I know we've said quite often mentioned film and less often fiction, but yeah, it's those kind of concepts from watching things when I've been growing up to writing my own stuff. That's the sort of stuff that really draws me towards cyberpunk.
Nice. And Tim, what about you?
Yeah, this is always a hard question, because I think often people start writing, and then for me, I started writing, then someone said, "Oh, you're a cyberpunk writer." And I went, "Oh, okay, sure, why not?"
I didn't choose that.
Yeah, I suppose you are. I mean, for me, it was an obsession with, I love hardboiled fiction. I love Dashiell Hammett. I do from working in aid and so forth, and I'm interested in very political. Cyberpunk can be, it's not always, but can be very political, very dark, and it very much suited my sensibilities. But I suppose the thing about cyberpunk is it's punk. So it's anti-authoritarian and anti-elite and countercultural, and to some extent anti-capitalist. And cyberpunk stands on the side of the marginalized. Yeah, it takes the view from the streets. And I see cyberpunk kind of as a literature of defiance. And I suppose the idea, one of the things about cyberpunk that I'm attracted to is that you're not writing, it's not the hero's journey, it's not a happy ending. You're people who are just trying to retain some sense of humanity in the face of this crushing system, and they usually lose. But in a sense, I suppose it's a very humanist genre, and that's maybe what's attracted me to it.
Yeah. Well, this is setting up perfectly for more or less like the origins of the genre. You touched on a few things, but there's a lot of noir and detective story influence. And that noir aesthetic has carried through a lot of what has defined cyberpunk, big themes and aesthetics like the morally gray characters or the oppressive systems in the more dystopian settings. The low life and high tech kind of thing is an extension of the rough hierarchies of society in a lot of noir stories. And then on top of that, you have access to a certain thing. But in the case of cyberpunk, a lot of the time it's access to technology, or it's capitalism run amok, and people are left destitute in that sense. So Tim, if you could continue on this a little bit in terms of things that you've discovered while writing your doctorate thesis, while studying the genre, and then while writing your own fiction about the origins of cyberpunk.
Well, I mean, I won't speak for too long because I'm kind of curious about what everyone thinks, but I will, but I'll focus on a couple of things. One of the antecedents of cyberpunk, I do think, is hardboiled fiction. I think that if you look at Neuromancer and if you look at Blade Runner, William Gibson and Ridley Scott both acknowledge the influence of hardboiled fiction in their work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at even Dashiell Hammett's fiction of hardboiled fiction of 1929 and the 1930s, even though at the time it was just seen as detective fiction, really, I think in some ways it was a critique of modernity. It was a critique of labor versus capital. He was talking about the dark city as something that's alienating. Yeah. He was looking at the way because he was a Pinkerton detective in real life. And he saw the clash of labor versus capital. And he saw how alienating that was. And he went from that into writing. He was refused to name names, I think, in the McCarthy hearings. What are they? The Un-American Committee or whatever they're called. And he went to jail. And this is a dude who fought in 2 world wars. And he joined the Communist Party. So he was quite radicalized by his experience with those early days of the transformation, urbanization. And I think that thread has gone through film noir very clearly into neo-noir and into cyberpunk. I mean, one of the original names for cyberpunk was tech noir, for good reason. Before whoever it was, the guy who wrote the short story named it cyberpunk and thought of a way better name than tech noir. So we had to stick with that. So I think at its core, and I do think these thematic issues have continued through to cyberpunk, is there is a critique of modernity there. And if we look today, cyberpunk, it's critiquing staggering inequality, surveillance capitalism, all these different things. And I think you can draw that line back to the hardboiled fiction of 80 years ago, 90 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Craig, do you wanna build on what Tim has been exploring?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the thing I find about cyberpunk is it's probably one of the oddest genres when you come to try and define it, because a lot of people have sometimes not opposing views, and I think the aesthetic that was derived from films like Blade Runner have a large part of that, where sometimes if it isn't mega corporations and hardboiled detectives and neon and rain slick streets, sometimes people don't even think it's cyberpunk. You could quite easily say that Mr. Robot was a cyberpunk piece of work, but if you try and put that to people, sometimes they just wouldn't accept it because it's aesthetically it's not like that, or it's not set in the future. But it does have a lot of sort of cyberpunk themes.
But we're living in a cyberpunk present, so of course you can set it down. All the things that they were warning us about exist right now. So Mr. Robot is Black Mirror is absolutely. Sorry, Craig.
No, it's okay. So that's what I'm saying. It's strange because you've got one aspect of cyberpunk, which is, the retro futurism going back to the 80s, and you've got the whole sort of techno orientalism, and especially in Blade Runner, like the use of kanji and the fear of Japan and all that sort of stuff. So if you're writing cyberpunk, you can almost kind of write it from that perspective, or you can kind of look at it from like a modern take, and almost kind of project into the future from where you are today. So you've almost got like two options for how you want to kind of approach a cyberpunk work, whether you want to adopt all of the old school sort of tropes and the retro futurism, or whether you want to take a more modern approach and more of a post cyberpunk kind of view. So yeah, I just find I haven't seen any other genre where you can see people arguing online about whether something is or isn't cyberpunk. You don't typically get that of people having arguments online about what is and isn't space opera. It's just a very strange genre for me from that perspective, because, as I say, there's a lot of people can't agree on what cyberpunk is.
Even though I would say space opera is just as nebulous as cyberpunk as well, but I think there is a certain sort of structure to space opera that people, I think, are a little bit more happy to define, such as alien races and faster than light travel and spaceships and blah 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 blah. But cyberpunk is perhaps even more nebulous than space opera. But I like what you say about there's sort of this genre that has its foot in the past and the future at the same time, and it's really interesting to see how modern authors are adopting a stance for themselves within the canon, but also grappling with the genre's past while also looking toward a future that is more reflective of our own lived experience, the way that we're dealing with it right now. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I want to get Malka's take on, sort of the origins of cyberpunk, the things that we've been talking about, the noir elements and that kind of thing, and where you think or how you feel about where the genre has come from.
That is something I kind of want to draw on a little bit, because I think one of the interesting things in the way that cyberpunk has evolved, and I agree with a lot of what's already been said about the nebulousness and sort of how, the aesthetic took on a disproportionate importance, maybe. But, I think part of that was that, when cyberpunk was, when it was kind of invented, when it was starting, when it was thriving, it was very cutting edge, and it was very much imagining the future. And the punk part, I think, was really important in ways that we forget, or probably not we, but a lot of people forget, in the sense of this new thing, and the people who kind of got into the new thing from the ground level in a grimy and hands-on way had almost superpowers as this new thing became more and more important in society. And so, there's this feeling, along with all the darkness, right? There's this feeling of both potential and resistance, rebellion, and kind of, shortcutting or finding ways around things in clever ways that have to do with often risking a part of yourself or a lot of your means of existence or physical elements of your body in this new, virtual world. So I think that was really important to the genre, and that as cyber and the virtual have become just pervasive in our lives in most of the planet, that has gotten really diluted, and it's become sort of more complicated to access that feeling of punk and resistance, while at the same time, cyberpunk continues to feel cool, and the aesthetic is cool, and people want to do what the people they read when they were kids did, their stories. Right. And so people keep writing it, and and I think that there are those punk and resistance stories still out there, but they do play differently in a world where not everyone in reality, but everyone who is on the internet talking about it, at least, is already very hooked into this. So I think that the genre needs to if it's going to keep those punk roots and those resistance roots, needs to really look at, you know, who are the people who are actually using special skills in this area's resistance, and also like what are the newer areas that are breaking out and moving forward, either, you know, within the virtual or other stuff that would be interesting and useful to punk at this point. So yeah,
I like that. And Lincoln, as our resident punk, do you want to comment on what's been said?
Yeah, well, I agree with pretty much everything said. You know, if I did want to cycle back to something where I actually think that the Zoom issues are totally very cyberpunk.
Yeah,
because
I agree.
One of the things that drew me to the genre, and I think that this is a connection with Hardboiled as well, is that, you know, these genres explore the seams of society, right? Like where the different parts of society other, and where certain people fall through the gaps and all of that, right? And so there's a lot of that in Hardboiled fiction, and yeah, something like Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest could easily be updated as a brilliant cyberpunk book. One thing that really drew me to the genre, and that I think relates to this question, is that cyberpunk interrogates the frictions and the inequalities of technology in a way that a lot of science fiction doesn't. Like, I love Star Trek and stuff, but a lot of science fiction like that has this kind of world of seamless technology where it all works great and such. But cyberpunk, you know, from, you know, the opening of Neuromancer, where, you know, Case is in pain and there's a bartender who's half, you know, got European steelwork on his, you know, bleeding gums or whatever's happening. I haven't read that book in a while. But, you know, it interrogates that kind of part of technology in a way that a lot of science fiction doesn't. And that just feels increasingly relevant in a world in which, yes, we're super futuristic, but then technology breaks down all the time. And, you know what, that's obviously, there's that famous Gibson quote about the future's already here. It's just distributed unequally, right? But that's only more and more true as we get into this kind of global world of inequality on every level, from money to medical debt to access to technology to protection from climate change and so on and so forth. So that feels like a really relevant part of the genre's origins that kind of comes from hardboiled fiction, and that's an essential part of the DNA to me.
Yeah, and also something that I feel is a perfect extension of that is the settings in which a lot of cyberpunk stories take place. And a lot of the times they take place in cities. And I feel like cities are the kinds of places where it is easier for people to fall through the cracks, that there are more seams for people to slip into. And there is a sort of inherent hierarchy within cities of the poor, lower classes up to the uber rich and the corporations and stuff like that has been very present in cyberpunk since the early days. Tim, do you want to take off on that in terms of cities as sort of a setting, but also what makes them potentially an ideal setting for cyberpunk?
I do agree with what you're saying. However, there's also certainly in Australian neo-noir, there is and I think I've seen this in the States as well, but you do see how the country towns are fading away, and they're fading away because they're not relevant anymore in this global economy, and these communities and these peoples are disappearing. With the Dark City, I will say this: in some Australian cyberpunk, some including mine, and in some of our noir, instead of the Dark City, you have the desert, yeah? You have this blasted landscape. There's no shade. It's completely alienating. It's oppressive. There's almost a gothic horror associated with the natural environment. The thing about the Dark City is, or I should say, the thing about the environment without, it can reflect the internal psychological disposition of a protagonist. So if you think about a Dark City, it's alienating. It's oppressive, okay? To some extent, it's out to get you. If you think about a desert, it's alienating. It's oppressive. So it reflects the psychological disposition of the character you're talking about. So you can actually write cyberpunk out of the city, but there's if the climate is oppressive, it's reflecting what the character is going through on the inside. But of course, the thing about the Dark City, I think it goes back to urbanization, and I think it goes back to this new form of society where you have the homeless, you have people who don't have access to these advanced technologies, and that it is really very fertile ground for discussing these issues of inequality, because it's something that is familiar to us as well at the same time.
Yeah, and I like what you said. I'm happy that you brought up the desert. It is very fitting that for Australian neo-noir writers and sci-fi writers and stuff like that, the desert is kind of like obviously it's a natural extension of your lives as Australians, but it's also a natural extension of the cyberpunk genre, going back to something like Blade Runner, where outside of Los Angeles, nuclear woes and nuclear fear and the possibility of nuclear annihilation was kind of represented in the desertification of nature and the surrounding environments, and everyone conglomerating into these dark, decrepit, oppressive cities. But I like that duality that you brought up. That was really, really good point. Lincoln, do you wanna talk about cities a little bit, but also comment on what Tim said?
Yeah, well, I think you could write cyberpunk anywhere, and I think the point about the desert. I mean, my book actually ends in the character ends in the desert, so I can see that attraction. I think there's something, the cities lay bare these inequalities, right? Like everything is collaged together and stacked on top of each other, and you're in New York City, you're on the subway riding next to millionaires and homeless people, and not that those inequalities don't exist in small towns and such, but they're more, the barriers are enforced a little more, right? The wrong side of the tracks and all that. And in the city, it's all piled on top of each other. And so in that way, it seems like a natural, if not by any means exclusive, setting for the kind of cyberpunk themes. And I mean, I guess the other obvious thing about the city is that cities tend to be the center of technological progress and new ideas, just because there's so many people there and so many industries there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And Malka, do you want to touch on this a little bit? But also, in Infomocracy, for example, there's a lot of city hopping. You have different characters hopping to different cities around the world, like Tokyo. I believe I think it's Rio de Janeiro in South America, and in Brazil as well. So what's your take on cities, but then also how did you approach that from representing different cities that have a different sort of, as Lincoln was saying, stratification or layering in terms of crossover between different peoples from different strata?
Yeah, I mean, I was very conscious going into that book that, I mean, it starts in Japan, and that may be part of the reason that it was such a cyberpunk book in my head to begin with. But that's because I was working in Japan, and I was working in Japan in the aftermath of the 2011 tsunami and nuclear. And so there was like a specific mood there that really matched some of what I was going for in the opening of the book. But having connected Japan to cyberpunk, it was then very clear to me that like cyberpunk, along with a lot of other science fiction, tends to focus on Japan a lot, Asia more generally, well, East Asia, I should say more generally, and then the US and sometimes Europe, London a lot, Berlin sometimes. So, I was really, as I went into this, and particularly thinking about a book that wanted to talk about a mostly global system, I really wanted to make sure that I hit a lot of different places. And it was actually hugely fun for me to do that, because I got to take this idea and play it out through different places that I knew more or less well, and try to imagine them into the future. So it was a lot of fun. I did realize, as when I started thinking about the second book, that the first book had been very urban, very city centric. And I wanted to try to look at what it would be like in less urban, more remote places. So that's I tried to go into that more in the second book consciously. But I do think even though I'm someone who has lived in quite rural and remote places at various times in my life, I tend to gravitate towards cities and urban issues. And I think we tend to see that as a useful palette for painting these like inequalities and larger things, but also, new technology and the idea of things sort of burgeoning and spontaneously people coming up with things, right? But I think it is really important to look at both the rural areas and of all different varieties. And now I think too that's just, it's more and more clear that technology is really getting into, if you look at what they're doing with artificial intelligence on agriculture, or on what they're doing with mobile finance in places where people don't have banks. I mean, it's really getting into this and spurring some new stuff in a lot of these areas, and they're just going to be more and more crucial too as we worry more and more about our food supplies and our water supplies and so on. So I think it's an area that needs more looking. And again, I think we really need to be looking outside of the global north and the rich countries, and really thinking about the way that technology is being appropriated, to use that verb with all the love, like the way the technology is being taken and turned around and modified and used for different things than it was intended, and unlocked and switched around, because that is, those are the cyberpunk stories, whether they're happening, in people setting up free internet connections illegally in Detroit, where people are squatting in houses, or whether it's happening in the way that people are tweaking locked products when they go to places that nobody can afford them and turning them into something else. That's the punk element now, and that's what we need to be looking at if we want to continue this theme of resistance.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And it's really interesting for me. I live in Quito, Ecuador, and going to visit the Amazon jungle and staying with a community that's living there. And it's insane, like, to see an indigenous Amazonian tribe that has developed into a community, and everyone's got phones. They're in the middle of the Amazon, and it's just like, this guy who lives in the Amazon just whips out his phone and, shows us some pictures. And I'm just like, my mind was absolutely blown to see firsthand how pervasive technology has become, that I could go to the middle of the Amazon jungle, which in a lot of people's mind is one of the most remote places you can go in the world, and to find a community of people who have been living there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and one of them just whips out a phone, and it's absolutely insane. Craig, do you want to build on what everyone's been talking about in terms of, I guess at this point it's like urban and rural as a setting discussion?
If I can just point something or add something before we move on, I just that reminds me of a story by Alejo Carpentier, who's a Cuban writer, about it's called Los Pasos Perdidos, the lost.
Oh wow, the lost
and
steps.
It's the idea of this guy goes into the jungle and meets a community, and he thinks he's gone into the past, and it's such a common analogy to make, right? That if we're in some place remote where people are living the way they always have, we have gone to the past. And it's kind of the flip of this future being unevenly distributed. And I think that there's something really there about, like, less is what it really says more about us and what we think our future will look like, and like technological progressivism and who gets to have technology. And also, the past is like unchanging, and communities is unchanging if they're untouched by technology. And there's just, I think there's a lot wrapped up in that that's really interesting, and has a lot to do with why people are fascinated by cyberpunk and the types of cyberpunk that get written. So sorry, just wanted to put that in on that way.
No.
And yeah, over to you, Craig.
It was a good point. Thank you, Malka. Craig, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like story setting for Arvect, there was only really one logical place to set it, and that was the city. I guess just because I assumed you're not really going to have collectives of underground brain hackers running around grabbing people off the streets in rural countryside and things like that. But I guess as far as using city as a setting, what we talked about, I guess it's easier to kind of make those comparisons between, where things aren't equal between different levels of society. I know, I think, pretty sure it wasn't in the book, but in the TV series of Altered Carbon, when when they go and visit the Methuselahs, they literally live in the clouds, like floating kind of sort of like expanses of like real estate and things like that. And then obviously you've got the dregs of society kind of living on the streets. And I guess it's just easier with cities to try and make that sort of comparison. It's funny because as far as RVEC goes and like world building and using the city, I used the city to try and set up the fact that it looks like a utopia, but it's not really, and kind of lean into, what I talked about before about altering the perception of reality and how really what's happening in RVEC. And, it concentrates on London to start off with. Basically I'm obfuscating what's really going on through the use of technology, through the use of augmented reality. And the city just seemed like the best place to do that, because the city really is alive with all hosts of augmented reality sort of things that are happening in the city. And the city is like a living, breathing place where it looks like a tropical paradise, and you're using augmented reality to show that there's like trees growing and fish swimming around and like all this sort of crazy stuff that's almost like on the verge of fantasy, but augmented reality is bringing it to life. And the city just made it a lot easier to do that and kind of focus the fact that I am obfuscating reality through the use of augmented reality and using the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of builds on what Malka was saying about like the city as the palette with which you can paint the whatever sort of imagery you want. And in your case, it's like, not to say that London's a dreary place, but it often is. But to be able to paint an augmented brush across the city so that the people who live there have an altered perception of what their reality is, what they're actually experiencing. Yeah. And I like what you brought up about Altered Carbon, because that is, once again, we're back to a visual medium. But to see visually within the city itself, obviously there's a socio-political hierarchy, an economic hierarchy, but there's also a visual hierarchy with the urban landscape itself and the buildings that are reaching up into the sky, and the people that live up in the clouds as if they're, living in heaven, as if they're
gods almost,
gods or something like that. And Lincoln in the Body Scout, I think you call them sky stabbers and cloud condos, but it's literally the people who have money who can live higher up towards the clouds and have an actual view of like the sun and the city itself. But that's something that their economic status can afford.
Yeah, probably ripping off the Jetsons there, but it's a good metaphor. it still works.
I like the idea of a cloud condo. It sounds nice, And Lincoln, I'll toss this to you. You wrote this essay called in Uncanny Magazine called "The Future in the Flesh: Why Cyberpunk Can't Forget the Body." And you made a comment at the very beginning of it that I thought was just very tongue-in-cheek, but you said cyberpunk is dead, but I think that's a really interesting point to build upon, because what is cyberpunk today, in the sense that you are all here, we're all talking about cyberpunk and writing some amalgamation of cyberpunk, but why did you make that comment? But on top of that, you made arguments throughout the essay about why cyberpunk is not dead and how we can revitalize it. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the opening of that essay is kind of mimicking what people say a lot, right? So other people say that cyberpunk is dead all the time. And then, I was arguing that it wasn't. I mean, I think that, we've touched on some of this, right? That there's kind of a disjunction between cyberpunk is a set of kind of perhaps stale aesthetic signifiers of neon and that kind of Japan panic and all these other things we've talked about. And that does, to me, feel a little sterile at this point. But what I think most of us here consider more like the fundamental aspects of cyberpunk, these kind of thematic questions, do feel more relevant than ever. I mean, they almost feel so relevant that it feels like cliche to even point them out, right? But we live in a world in which the big corporations are only bigger and bigger, Amazon and Google. And we live in a world in which the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs get richer and richer and control more and more of our lives. And these technologies become more and more, dangerous to society, the effects of social media on politics. And, I'm just saying stuff that is talked about all the time, right? But how is that stuff not cyberpunk, right?
Exactly.
How are we not living in a very cyberpunk present? So I do think the genre has a lot of, juice left in its cybernetic arms or whatever metaphor I used to, and that, at least if we like Malka was saying, there are points of resistance and points of rebellion that we should be investing in our fictions that are maybe different than what they were in the 80s, but thematically all these things just feel only more relevant than ever. It's sad,
100%.
Sadly, or nice for the fiction, sad for our daily existence.
True. Well, as authors, it's good for you. So, Tim, what are your thoughts?
What was the question? For the setting?
More so about what the state of cyberpunk today and how you feel.
How we can keep it revitalized. Well, I mean, look,
yeah,
I set all of mine in Southeast Asia or Australia, where I lived, and I set it. The novels, for example, set in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, Hanoi, where I was living when I wrote the novel. Visually, yes, it's a very cyberpunk city. For all the things, it's this huge, frenetic metropolis, heavily polluted. But the interesting thing about Vietnam is, not the interesting thing, but one of the compelling things about Vietnam is how it's just been this pawn of empires throughout its history. The pawn of a Chinese empire, of the French Empire, the Japanese Empire, the American Empire, and then back to China again. And I think I think cyberpunk is one means through which you can discuss issues of colonialism, for example. Vietnam is also a place where individual and collective memory is often repressed. Again, cyberpunk is really good at talking about memory manipulation, memory wipes. But also, I think this happens less often, but I think there's some interesting stories and novels to be had on the way collective memory can be manipulated. Although that, of course, goes back to 1984. So I think that for me, cyberpunk, if you're looking at, if we are going into a Chinese century, as many are saying, and that's not an unreasonable claim, I think cyberpunk is really one of the best subgenres to explore that. What if America breaks up and China is the sole superpower? What next? And then if you want to talk about a surveillance state and social credit schemes and neo-colonialism, wow, cyberpunk has got all the instruments you need and all the intellectual tools you need to explore that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And Craig, what are your thoughts on cyberpunk today and how you feel in terms of where it's come from to what Tim and Lincoln said about more contemporary issues that it can tackle?
Yeah, I agree with Tim, because I think if you look at 80s cyberpunk, and it was the fear of Japan becoming this global superpower that was going to steamroll over the world with its technology and its cultures. As Tim says, you could quite easily forecast that potentially happen with China. And this social credit system, if that was rolled out on a global scale, what would that mean? And yeah, I totally agree. I think cyberpunk is the perfect medium to explore the horror, the potential horror of what that would mean for society and how that technology could be used and not used. I think that's a good thing that cyberpunk is good at looking at, is how technology is abused to kind of maintain this elitism between the haves and the have-nots, really.
I mean, I should add that I think that, sorry to interrupt, Craig, but that
no, go for it.
We're also very much talking about the present. We're talking. We're not being predictive. We're being descriptive. And we might extrapolate, we might take the DNA of the present and put it out in the future. But so much of what I'm talking about, if I said it 100 years from now, it's happening right now, you know. But sorry, Craig, keep going.
No, that was it. That was it, really. I just think for me, if I'd want to see cyberpunk kind of moving forward, it would be more authors kind of looking at taking a snapshot of where we are and almost taking like a hard sci-fi look at world building based on where we are and with where we're going to go, and really diving into that punk aesthetic about how could you potentially overthrow a system. And I know it was said, you know, the stories sometimes don't end in a good place, and you don't really have a hero of the story. They don't end up changing the world, but you know, how could we drive that punk aesthetic and that punk ideology, and how to actually make some meaningful change? Or is it impossible?
I don't think anything's impossible. I think it's just all it takes is imagination. And Malka, I'll toss it to you as well. But I think, you know, you've mentioned resistance and the punk aesthetic. Do you feel like that punk aesthetic, you know, obviously it exists today, but what are your thoughts on what it is and what could change about that sense of cyberpunk as a form of resistance, as a form of counterculture, the way it was so present in the 1980s with, you know, like Gibson and Bruce Sterling and Pat Cadigan and all the others who really had this sense of fuck the system, you know, like fuck the corporations, but at the same time giving meaningful critique on the lives of everyday people and the reality that we're living in day to day.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as I've said, I do think that there's very cyberpunk action being taken today in various different ways and places. But I do think that it's a very different positioning to be cyberpunk in a world where cyber is pervasive throughout everything than it is in a world where cyber is emerging and new, and there's this like race to stake out territory in it. So, which is why, you know, on the one hand, I think we get these these stories now that are about, you know, the single corporation that owns everything and everyone belongs to it, and then there's the chosen one hero who comes up against it and breaks the thing, and that's, you know, that's okay, but it is very different from what the early cyberpunk was. And on the other hand, as I mentioned before, you know, I think there's the kind of newer things that we're pushing into now, whether it's I don't know, like body modding and bio cyber stuff, or whether it's you know, other kinds of technology that we're starting to see as, oh, this is new and exciting and not enough people know how to do it, and so if I learn, I can be that underground hero who's using it to undermine things before the corporations get the full like complete grip on the technology, even if they already have a grip on the world. So like I think that there's sort of both those routes towards dealing with it, and that, you know, we should continue to push at this and ask these questions, because we do live in a world now where, you know, it's not just that everyone wants to be online, it's that increasingly you cannot get normal adulting done without having access, and really access mediated through this small number of companies. And yeah, like I said, that's a very different thing to be revolting against. And it is very important that we continue to revolt against it and continue to think about, you know, what does it mean when it's not just that you can be a smart hacker and figure out a way around a company's code, but that they own all the infrastructure of transmitting the information that has become, you know, the figurative lifeblood of economy, but also the way people get, you know, medicine or food or learn about dangers or help each other during disasters.
Yeah, I like that. And it really gives me hope because, I was joking that, Lincoln wrote this line, Cyberpunk is dead. And I know it was tongue in cheek and I thought it set up the tone of that essay really well. And, just for me personally, beyond this conversation, just witnessing what is going on in terms of books and film and TV and all that stuff, it's like Cyberpunk is not dead. But at the same time, there may be tropes or aesthetics or critiques within the cyberpunk genre that we would like to die, as opposed to, these new emerging technologies and circumstances that give us new emerging critiques and things that can be implemented into cyberpunk stories. Lincoln, I'll toss it back to you in terms of, us living in a cyberpunk reality. And, do you feel that there are a lot of tropes and things in the cyberpunk genre that have outstayed their welcome? They feel worn out, and you'd like to see this transition into a new age of critique?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's some, if we're talking about like video games and movies more than books, right? There's some properties that are visually trapped in the cyberpunk 1980s, right? In a way where the punk characters look like 1980s hardcore punks, but they have a cyborg arm. And some of that like surface level aesthetics just feels a little, we've been doing it for 40 years now. Maybe you got to change up how characters look. On a more like, I wouldn't say that I think that this is something that needs to be jettisoned from the cyberpunk genre, but personally, I am a little less interested in this moment in virtual reality as a space for cyberpunk kind of stories. I feel like that feels a little played out. I don't think it will be forever. But when I go online and see Facebook or Meta's, sterile Playmobil metaverse, I'm like, okay, let's wait until it gets dystopian again. Now it just seems silly. So, in my book, it's focused more on emerging biotech, genetic modification, all these kind of emerging technologies. And maybe that's kind of a general thing is a look at different emerging technologies, not just virtual reality. Not that I think I'm by any means the only author who's not just looking at virtual reality. But that's one thing I feel like is, for the moment at least, maybe a little stick.
Mm-hmm. And Craig, is someone who includes a lot of conversation about reality in your work, more on the augmented side, but what are some tropes that you're a bit tired of when it comes to cyberpunk, and something you'd like to see brought more into the forefront?
I think just need more punk, really. I can't think, and again, I'm thinking more about, movies and TV series and things like that. I can't think of any recent sort of films where they were really rebelling against some sort of system. I think maybe Matrix is probably one of the last big ones where, the fight is to overthrow the whole system. Maybe Elysium a little bit. Maybe it's just the lack of cyberpunk sort of media that's out at the moment. But yeah, I think we need to bring the punk back. I think that's what I'd definitely like to see.
Summing up the whole podcast, bring back the punk, people. And Malka, what about you in terms of, some tropes that you're a bit tired of, and I know you want to see more punk and rebellion as well, but something else that you're, hoping to see subsume a lot of the tired conversations of the genre?
Yeah, definitely the way women are typically portrayed in it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you do get a fair number of sort of badass women, but they're often very performatively badass, and not centered. And I guess I'm thinking again of Sneakers, having just seen it. And again, it's not totally what I would call like uber representative of the genre, but it does touch on a lot of sort of these themes, and one of them is like, oh, this is a boys club of boys playing with technology and they're not in the real world or whatever, but of course they are actually saving the world. And I think that is kind of a thing that runs through a fair amount of it. So, and you know, along with that, as I said, more attention to other places that are not either white or East Asian, and considering that those places have technology and futures too. Definitely, and this is more general, but I do think cyberpunk falls into it sometimes, like getting rid of the chosen one thing. Also, I'm just like, so yeah, all those things.
I'm tired of the chosen one across the board in
I
fiction.
don't
in
even
general.
I don't even know if Cyberpunk never really did chosen one very much, though, right?
I mean, maybe
It's
not
like an
as much as
amalgamation of the
others.
chosen one as like, I wouldn't necessarily chosen one as in like saving the world, but someone who is chosen to wield the technology in such a way where they can defeat a
Is this the Matrix?
really oppressive.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
The Matrix is the big one. Malka, go ahead.
they're often very special, even if they're not
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the chosen one who will save the world, like you said, but they're often like the person who has the unique skills or the person who has the unique background. So like I'm thinking even, you know, that sort of last ditch, oh, hero protagonist's father actually knew the big bad guy and they fought. Like there's a whole Star Wars thing in there worked into there. And then, you know, I think even Gibson, like not to the total extent, but like there's definitely a sense of like aura around the main characters. And I think that's where I also get a little bit annoyed. And who gets to be that special glowy person
with all the technological augmentation that makes them even more special. Yeah, Tim, what are some tropes or things that you're tired of?
A lot of what everyone said. When I'm feeling provocative, I say if there is a chosen one, it's not cyberpunk. So I'm with Malka on that one. I, in a completely self-interested way, also agree that anything outside of the States and East Asia we should start reading more of. That's only because all my stuff's out there. But I think for me, what am I sick of? I think that the issue with cyberpunk is that it's, as someone said they were reviewing my book and they said, cyberpunk, when it's good, is some of the best science fiction. When it's bad, it's the very, very worst. And I think what he was getting at, fortunately, he didn't say mine was the very worst, but what he was getting at in the review was that when you strip the thematic stuff away or the punk away from the cyber, it really fucking sucks. Yeah. And so if you do just have, if you want to have neon and cybernetic limbs and long trench coats, that's fine, but have the punk in there as well. So what I'm sick of seeing is that we have, you see it in video games, you see it in some novels, is when people are writing what they call cyberpunk, but which really is stripped of anything that has any thematic resonance, which is what I think the genre is about. I do think it can be a very political subgenre. And like I said, I do think it can be the literature of defiance. And when that's all stripped out and you just have those surface elements, which are gorgeous in a way, but which without anything underneath it does make it kind of dull and repetitive. So that's for me is the cyberpunk that's stripped of the punk, I suppose.
I feel the same way because for me, the biggest thing, that's why Ghost in the Shell is one of my absolute favorites, because aesthetically it's very beautiful, but thematically it's very powerful. The way that it projects its message through a very streamlined narrative is so impressive. Just the breadth of commentary that it has, obviously coming from a Japanese perspective. So from a cyberpunk viewpoint, it's interesting because of the Japan panic that was pervasive in a lot of cyberpunk for so long. And then something like Ghost in the Shell is like, we are in Japan. And so how do Japanese people feel about all this? And that was really cool. And I think thematic resonance is, like you say, Tim, so integral to what makes good cyberpunk, great cyberpunk, as opposed to the trash that gets tossed to the bottom of the pile, and people can just kind of gloss over because it doesn't really have much to say. And all of you approach cyberpunk's big themes in very interesting ways in your work. So I want to toss out to each of you individually a different theme, something that I know you cover in your work, and I want to get your perspective on how you approach that from a contemporary perspective. And then if anyone else wants to get in on that topic, just jump in for it. Lincoln, I will go with you first in terms of things like, I'm gonna, bunch these together, but transhumanism, biotech, and the human body.
And just how do I approach that with like a cyberpunk kind of theme?
Yeah, but just generally from your perspective and your role as a writer, how do you approach that in your stories?
Yeah, well, I think yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a lot of the stuff that we've been saying already, right? Like, I'm really attracted to where there's the friction in society and how technology is deployed, and where there's kind of gaps and seams and all of that. So one thing that I wanted to explore in the book was this focus on biotech and modification of the human body and all these technologies that are emerging, and how that is probably going to be quite, and is in the present, unequally distributed, and how that is where the kind of ideological and personal reactions differ to that too, right? So in my book, there's a lot of groups and individuals that all have kind of different relations to these technologies, whether embracing it, rejecting it, embracing parts of it, subverting it. So that was something I really wanted to explore in that kind of technological realm. Otherwise, a lot of it is, I think cyberpunk is, in its, as like a kind of literature of defiance and critique, is, often quite satirical. So a lot of it for me was just kind of taking what already exists and hyperbolizing it a bit, right? I mean, we already live in a world in which, or especially here in America, where, people die from medical debt, and there's, complete inequality of access to, monkeypox vaccines, COVID vaccines, whatever we have going on at the moment. So it was pretty easy to just kind of take that and extrapolate it a bit and satirize it a bit.
Yeah, and it was cool how you use baseball and sports as a sort of foundation for this conversation, because there's a lot of conversation today about sports and the future of it, and how things like cybernetic enhancement or biotech enhancement could play into the realm of sports, when it is right now a biological game. But what happens when it becomes a cybernetic game? But then you kind of imagine past that, what happens when people ban the cybernetic game and make it a biotech pharmaceutical game and all this kind of stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the sports world in many ways is like at the forefront of a lot of those kind of questions, and has been for a long time, right? I grew up in the 90s when, baseball, Major League Baseball had its big steroid scandals, and it was all these debates about like, when is a technology, when is a medicine permittable, and when isn't it? When is it chemistry defining a sport, and when is it biology? And there's no right answer or kind of clear answer to any of those things. But it seemed like a natural setting for those kind of fraught questions. Yeah,
for sure. And Craig, in your case, you have this focus on augmented reality and ARVECT in the Instant Reality series. But can you kind of describe your approach to how you wanted to incorporate augmented reality? I guess we can also include virtual reality in this conversation as well, but the ways in which you approach this concept of what is reality and how can technology play with that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, a lot of that was born out of, one of my favorite novels of all time is Scanner Darkly. And that's, that's about your whole perception of reality. And I know that's drugs, which are basically, substance D splitting your brain into, and two sides of the brain don't talk to each other. And then that's when you get the split of reality. But then also the concept of memories from Blade Runner. And it was just this whole concept again of a bit from like some concepts from the Matrix, which I found just really compelling. The fact that what you're actually seeing isn't what's actually happening. And augmented reality just seemed to be the perfect technology to be able to do that. So with the RVECs are grown in from birth. You've got no say over whether or not the technology is the wetware's in your brain, constantly turned on. You can't turn it off. And some of this was story reasons, because if you could turn it all off, the whole story collapses and it doesn't work. But at the same time, if I think about, the form factors that you use for augmented reality. So at the moment, you've got, they're trying to get sort of lenses to like glasses to work. And then the next form factor is going to be contact lenses. For me, like, because I'm a solution designer in my day-to-day job, the perfect sort of connection to technology would be, well, if it's just in your brain. And I know that's kind of scary from a cyborg point of view, having something in your brain. But if I was thinking of everyday use of, if I just wanted to instantly switch to being in a virtual reality construct and be able to host meetings or do something else or go and play something online or go and explore something virtually, then if you could just instantly think of it and you were just in that world. And likewise with the augmented reality, because everything's overlaid over the top of reality, and it's written as if the whole world is a paradise. And obviously the whole reason I'm doing that is because the reality is obfuscated for nefarious reasons, but a lot of the memories kind of come in as well. So when Tannis is being brain hacked, it's our memories that are being used against her, and kind of it's almost reconstructing your existing memories into a happy memory that doesn't really exist, to try and get your brain state to a certain level to allow the brain hacks to work and things like that. So it's just, again, leaning into those things that I talked about before, about just really interested in the fact that what you're seeing isn't really there. And augmented reality is just the perfect way of doing that, really.
Very cool. And Tim in 36 Trees, for instance, sort of as an extension of what Craig was saying, you play with the idea of memory a lot in the book. Memory and identity. I think these are things that are very present in that novel. How did you approach that, and how did you approach the idea of memory and the identity of your character through things like, on one hand, technology, but on the other, trauma, for instance?
Oh man, these are hard questions for 1:20 a.m.
I'm throwing you curveballs, buddy.
Look, memory is, I think, important in Cyberpunk, because if you can screw with memory, you can screw with the soul. Everything we are, anyone we've ever known, everyone we've ever loved, all our fears, all our hates, it's all in memory, save the thin edge of the present. So if you can have a technology that can manipulate that, you potentially have someone that can manipulate the soul, whatever you believe the soul to be, but in the humanist sense of the soul. In terms of trauma is something that I did think a lot about in my work. It's something that, working in aid before I was a writer, that certainly in my industry and amongst colleagues, and of course sometimes the people we're dealing with, this trauma is pervasive. So it's something that I wanted to look at. Firstly, I wanted to just in a gritty way, as this is not necessarily cyberpunk, but do have real consequences of violence for the perpetrator and for the victim. It was very important. Because I'm fading a bit, I had to look up a quote about my novel and trauma because I couldn't remember it. I'm getting tired. But this is the Sunday Times said this about the novel. It said, "This is a kick down the door account of how past traumas, personal and national, may one day be weaponized for social control." Because trauma is, again, something that, if someone's playing with our trauma, that's another way of dehumanizing us. I'll give you an example from a short story, because this is a simple one rather than the novel, which is quite complex. But in one of my short stories, I looked at a technology where this guy had PTSD. He was a refugee from Vietnam. He came to live in Australia, and the government said, "You've got trauma. It's affecting your life negatively. We can remove this memory, and your quality of life will improve." So let's take the best possible use of memory manipulation. The best, not an evil corporation, but a benign health system, let's say, that's saying, we'll remove your trauma. And the story was about, if you strip away that person's trauma, are you taking away something that defines them as a person? So I, from that perspective, I wanted to look at it. What is the best possible use of memory manipulation? And even in the best case scenario, is it still dehumanizing? And that story is called Flame Trees in my collection. So I think that answers your question. And if it doesn't, I'm still finishing my answer.
It's all good, man. That was perfect. And that, I highly recommend everyone check out that short story. It's very, very good. And, you know, there is this sense of, yeah, like what, you know, on individual level, but also collective level, how trauma can manipulate the brain and the way memory works. But then when technology comes into play, how that can manipulate as well. And Malka, I'll toss this to you in terms of another form of manipulation, which is information, and how information plays into things like politics and elections, but also the way artificial intelligence is infused into that equation as a form of, you know, perhaps collecting that information, but also on a story level, on a conflict level, a way of manipulating who gets access to information or what people perceive as real information.
Yeah, I mean, I just got really interested in politics, meaning me in the res publica sense, you know, in the ways that we organize ourselves to get things done collectively as a technology, and how we don't really think of it that way. And I don't want to say we've stopped innovating, because there is a lot of innovation being done in there's a lot of innovation being done in political manipulation, but even in the kind of like basic, like how we run a democracy, like what democracy means, it is happening, but it's mostly kind of not happening in very visible ways for a lot of people. And I think there's this kind of sense that, oh, when we reach democracy, and we have to say that in quotes because it's not, but when we reach democracy, we won and it's over now, and we just have to keep voting every 4 or 6 whatever years, and that means we're good. And so there's that element, and then the ways that specifically, you know, technology changing has changed what democracy means, both in its potential, what it could be, but also, you know, how people can manipulate it. And you know, 4 years is a very different amount of time now than it was when it moved at the speed of horseback. And you know, the amount of effort it takes for people to vote is very different. And so, you know, so I was really interested in kind of critiquing the relative lack of innovation in politics, and the way that the willingness of people who are very invested in tech, literally invested in tech, to innovate and to use that on politics is just this huge gaping security flaw. Yeah, so as you know, I found it a useful way to approach both of these, in part aesthetically, because, you know, cyberpunk traditionally has a lot of spies, you know, and it has a lot of like secret agent type people, and sort of chase scenes, and people who are manipulating stuff for money and power. And you know, it has a lot of that sort of intrigue built into it already. And so I wanted to get that. And but you know, I was also really, really thinking about how technologies have changed things. And you know, if we want to base our political systems on the people making decisions, then in order to control that, you just have to control the basis on which people make those decisions, which is sometimes emotion, and sometimes a sort of a generational loyalty to a certain political party, and sometimes it's the information that they get. A lot of times it's the information that they get combined with those other things. So, you know, it's pretty cyberpunk, really. It's
I think so.
just not maybe in the usual way.
Yeah.
And I am also fading fast, so I'm gonna have to get off soon because I'm nodding.
No worries. We're gonna wrap this up a little bit. Lincoln, you mentioned right at the beginning whether, you know, the punk conjunction should even be used anymore, which is a little bit of foresight there. You know, cyberpunk has so many subgenres and derivatives like biopunk, nanopunk, post-cyberpunk, solar punk, what have you. Lincoln, if you want to start us off, if you think they have the power to, you know, resuscitate the genre and take it in a new direction, just to make it relevant again.
The various subgenres there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, this is like an old debate, right? But I mean, to me, cyberpunk is a pretty good term, and it's a genre that initially really did have that punk ethos that we've all kind of been talking about. I think some of the derivatives maybe don't tend to. I feel like maybe a lot of steampunk books are a little more like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you were like an aristocrat with a helicopter to fly over your serfs or something? So, you know, I'm not saying that they couldn't be used for that critique, but I'm not sure it's built into some of those derivative genres as it is in cyberpunk. But I, you know, this has been said, I think, by everyone on this panel, but I agree that cyberpunk should have that core, right? Like, so that core punk ethos in there, and that kind of those kind of themes and ideologies, or what we're calling, you know, the kind of a look at the people falling through the cracks, a sense of defiance and rebellion. I think all of that kind of needs to be in the genre, and including in the derivative genres if you're gonna use the term punk.
Yeah, so maybe cyberpunk, keep the punk, but don't put punk on the end of whatever fucking thing you want to do, like cowpunk or like car punk or some bullshit like that.
Yeah,
Tim,
punk.
what are your thoughts on it? Tweet punk.
Oh God, I am fading. What's the question again? That is cyberpunk cool? Yeah, I love it. No, what's the question?
If you think that these many subgenres, derivatives have a way of, you know, lifting up cyberpunk and taking
I
it in the future,
read that.
you feel like, well,
I don't read that shit, man. I don't know. I'm with Lincoln on that. Like, I do. Yeah, they do want to stick punk on the end of a lot of things. I don't read it. It's kind of a truthful answer, so I couldn't say too much. I've been invited, I think, to write for, I think it was Solar Punk. I got asked to submit a story, and I did, and then they didn't accept it. So I don't know.
I guess I'm not solar punk enough.
Well, too much punk and too little solar, I think.
You live in Australia, man. You got plenty of sun.
Yeah.
And Craig, do you have any thoughts on this idea of like subgenres or derivatives of cyberpunk?
I think just slapping punk on anything that you want to seem slightly edgy or cool at the end, it just detracts from cyberpunk for me, to be honest. So yeah, people should stop doing it.
Don't do that anymore.
We're all getting pretty surly towards the
end. All tired and grumpy and stuff. Malka, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that punk just sounds cool and they put it on whatever and they forget the actual meaning. It's very annoying. But you know, I mean, like I said, I think that there's important new ground to be forged in some of the newer technologies coming out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think that cyber has a monopoly on anything, but I do think people just throw around these labels too easily, as they do dystopia, which I have a major
that's another one.
Dystopia. My goodness, it's not that bad if they win in the end.
Exactly. That's not a dystopia.
Right. So yeah, we might be cranky.
That's all good. Yeah, I think Lincoln, you put it well. It's like if you incorporate punk into it in some way, then it deserves the punk conjunction. But if you don't have any punk and you just want to make it look cool, it's just like, get out of here with your bullshit labeling and trying to make yourself cooler than you actually are. And we'll wrap this up. I would like each of you to share, you know, since you've all written in the cyberpunk genre, since you're all passionate about it and you have laid out a ton of amazing, amazing thoughts during this discussion. Craig, we'll start with you. If you have a piece of advice for anyone who's breaking into the cyberpunk genre today.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think just familiarize yourself with all the themes and the concepts, really, and get on board with the whole punk ethos. I don't know, just have a go at forecasting from today and see where those themes are going to take you.
I like that. And Lincoln?
Yeah, I agree. Like, I mean, for any genre you want to write in, I think it's always great to read very widely in that and understand the kind of constellation of that genre or something. And I'm kind of stealing this line from a bit of a writing professor of mine, Sam Lipsyte, but it's kind of like you can create this constellation for yourself and then you notice where are the gaps, right? Where do you fit in? Where is there something that hasn't been done that you can add to the conversation of any genre?
And something that feels reflective of you as an individual and the things that you like to discuss.
Yeah, that's always the best way.
Yeah, it's like which tropes do you want to apply? Which ones do you want to completely ignore? Which ones do you think you can completely subvert and throw people's expectations? And as you say, Adrian, it's like, how to put a new spin on something that's not been done before, thinking about, how technology can be applied that's never been applied before.
Mm-hmm. And Tim, what about you?
I mean, I think just with writing in general, you write what you love, and you write what you know, and you write what you care about. And I feel like it's better to do that, and then at the end of it, you're like, oh, I'm writing cyberpunk. I think that's a better way to do it than you sort of front load. I want to do something sexy. Cyberpunk, and then you go into it like that. I mean, I could give I've done articles. I think I pulled it up for this interview, but then I never looked at the article. But I have written an article about all the fiction from hard-boiled to proto-cyberpunk to anime to modern. If you go look at my website, and that's got all the things.
I'll put the links for that in the description, as well as Lincoln's essay that I mentioned earlier.
It's called I've called it rather egotistically the ultimate cyberpunk primer. That might be a little bit over the top. Look, you can do those reading lists and sure, read widely, but I do think you get all the things you love and you throw that into your work with everything you got. And like it was said, it's hopefully in a new space too, where someone, maybe you haven't seen it before and you've wanted to read it. No one's really doing it. And then at the end, whether it's cyberpunk, whether it's fantasy, whether it's crime, whatever it is, then, but I think, I don't think you should front load a genre. I think you should get there at the end.
I like that. And Malka, some advice from you as well.
I mean, I think it's been really well covered so far, but I'm hoping that at this point I can get away with the video. Also, you'll notice if I actually fall asleep while I'm talking. But I agree. I mean, it's fair, and it's often a path to writing is to want to like write what you love, as you said, and kind of imitate and go that aesthetic. And aesthetic, we've been kind of slamming aesthetics, but aesthetics can be great, and like having a mood to what you're writing can be really important. But I do think there's the stuff you write for practice, and then there's a point at which you have to add something that comes from you, and just be especially when we're writing about stuff that is so linked into technology and its effects on society, we really want to be thinking about how that has changed in the intervening years, and the fact that what we understand by cyber is not what was this sort of nebulous, half menacing, half promising thing. Well, it's still that, but it's much less nebulous now than it was when Gibson coined the term. And And you know, I think there's a ton of really exciting, interesting, and super important stuff to be writing about how technology is evolving today and how it is affecting society and how society is reacting to it, and the way that people are sleepwalking into it, and the way large corporations are taking over and making it so pleasant and slick and cool that you will sign that terms of service on your new phone. And so there's a lot of stuff we can be angry about and interested in, and so it's really important that we continue to be looking at the world around us, observing the world around us, at the same time as we're offering homage to the aesthetics and the really interesting stuff that happened in this genre in the past.
I like that. That is a perfect note to end on. Pay homage, but bring it into the present. Infuse it with yourself. Be passionate. Be angry. Be fucking punk. And bring cyberpunk into a new age. And just to close out, I would like each of you to recommend, you know, from your perspective, something that you really love, an essential cyberpunk work, whether it's a book or a movie or an anime, what have you. Craig, go for it.
I think a more recent one that I don't see getting probably enough coverage is Upgrade. So it's basically about kind of what Tim was talking about, someone who experiences trauma and he ends up as a paraplegic, and then he already knows this kind of tech guru who's like this kind of Zuckerberg kind of socially awkward kind of guy, and he gets a chip implanted in his spine called STEM, and it helps him walk again. And then, you know, as we talked, it's like the best cyberpunk, it does not end well, and just the ending is just absolutely amazing. So yeah, I think it's a bit pulpy, it's a bit like action sort of heavy, but it does have that kind of that message there, and some of the sort of important cyberpunk themes around like control of your own body, and you know, the importance of technology and things like that. But yeah, check out Upgrade. It's a good ride.
Yeah, awesome recommendation. Lincoln, what about you?
Well, you know, a book that I was really taken with this year that I think has some cyberpunk ethos in it is The Immortal King Rao by Wahini Vara. So I would recommend that. It's a great book about it has like a lot of dystopian elements and a lot of, I would recommend it. The Immortal King Rao.
Nice. And Tim, recommendation?
I was looking at my list of books I read this year. I haven't read a single cyberpunk. I don't read a lot when I'm writing it. I read very, very widely, but I tend not to read in the particular, or I should, read in the particular subgenre I'm writing. And I'm just trying to find something. I'm looking at last year's now. Geez, I haven't read. It's been a while. This is embarrassing.
Even if it's a movie or an anime or whatever.
Oh man, my brain's not working. That's not cyberpunk. I can't even give you anything from the last couple of years. I apologize.
It can even be an old movie, something that's a really essential piece for you.
Oh, it's essential? Oh, I read Dashiell Hammett once a year. One of his books once a year. I've read all of them. It's not cyberpunk, but it's just fucking great writing. And if you do want to master the art of writing elegantly and spare prose, that's the person to go to. And no offense if anyone's written a big fat cyberpunk book, but I instinctively mistrust fat cyberpunk tomes. I want it elegant and mean and lean, you know. But I have not much to contribute to this last question. I apologize. Oh, read my book. There you go.
Yeah. Go read Neon Love.
Read everyone. Oh shit.
And 36 Streets.
Read everything. Everyone on this panel. We all sound pretty good. So get our stuff and then you'll be fine. Is that better?
This is the primer for Cyberpunk, right?
Yeah, it's right here. It's fine.
Malka, if you could just close us out with your pick for an essential film or book or anime, whatever you have in mind as an essential cyberpunk piece of work.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna pick out two new ones that I like a lot. One is the Chaos and Cat on Catnet duology by Naomi Kritzer, which is um, maybe kind of edges margins of cyberpunk, but it is. I thought it was a really interesting take on AI and community and sort of a lot of the near future phobias, and it's kind of stars teenagers, so I think by definition it's punk. Like they are angry about a lot of things. Reason to be. And they're really enjoyable books that I think they're also very rooted in the first one in small towns, and so they give a very different perspective, I think, on some of these issues, and are a lot of fun to read. And the other one is SB Divya's Machinehood,
Yes.
which is a really, again, like takes a lot of the tropes, takes them in new directions, and also like adds in a lot of stuff that often is so missing from these books, like family connections, like religious beliefs, like, just it's a very along with being a kind of wild ride, cyberpunk, interesting tech, there's also just a lot of societal details around it that make it a really comprehensive and enjoyable book.
Yeah, I second that choice as well. Machinehood is fantastic. And I'll close out with a recommendation for someone that I spoke to recently, and his book just came out just before this podcast is going to be released, and that's The Sleepless by Victor Manibo.
Oh, okay, cool.
That one's really cool concept of how hyperinsomnia as a pandemic translates into a critique of the news media and pharmaceutical companies and capitalism. It's really excellent, and it pulls a lot from the heart of the genre, but grounds it a little bit more in a personal story, and like SB Divya's book grounds it in family and friends and everything like that. So yeah, I highly recommend that. And Malka, Tim, Lincoln, and Craig, thank you all so much for exploring cyberpunk's past, present, and future with me. It means a lot, and honestly, I've learned so much. But if you could please let viewers and listeners know where they can find you on social media. Lincoln, I'll start with you.
Well, I waste a lot of my life on Twitter, and my handle is the Lincoln, which that's it.
You are the only Lincoln there is, and the Body Scout is your
yes.
last work. Very good book, especially for people who like baseball. Definitely go check that out. And Craig, what about you? Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so Twitter is just Craig Lee Gordon, and my website is craigleegordon.com. You can sign up for my newsletter there and get like a free book as well. And if you want to pick up like my last book, that's Arvect, just search on Amazon for that. And just something a bit more left field, if you fancied some cyberpunk techno and drum and bass to listen to, then head over to SoundCloud at Craig Lee Gordon. There's a cyberpunk mix there with stuff from Akira, Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, just a bit of OSTs mixed with techno and drum and bass. So if you fancy something smashing you in the face from a techno and drum and bass cyberpunk perspective, then check it out.
Cool.
A good writing soundtrack. And
yeah.
Tim's got his book, so he can pimp that a little bit. Tim, where can people find you?
My Twitter handle is the Escher Man, which if I sell it, it's going to be the next book that I have that comes out. The current one is 36 Streets with this very sexy cover, and that's probably all you need to know. I'm Instagram and those other places under T and Alpha, but I don't understand that yet, so I'm just sticking to I just put some pictures up. I don't know how it works.
Yeah, you'll figure it out, man. You're getting there. And Malka, where can people find you on social media?
So yeah, you can find me mostly on Twitter at M_Older. I kind of dabble in some of the others, but I'm not good at it. And my books, Infomocracy is kind of a biggie. The serial I wrote with Fran Wild and Curtis Chen and Jay Koyanagi for Serial Box, which is now Realm, called Ninth Step Station, which is now called Ninth Step Murders, is probably more traditionally cyberpunk. and it should be a really fun ride. And I have a book coming out early next year, which is called The Mimicking of Known Successes, which is not so much cyberpunk, maybe in a real stretch, but it's more of like a gas punk mystery romance where the gas is directly pumped up from the churning depths of a gas giant planet where this is set. So
very
go
punk.
pre-order.
Cool. Thank you
Yeah,
so
we-
much. Thank you so much, Malka, and thank you to everyone for joining me. I appreciate you talking cyberpunk. This was an awesome discussion. So
Thanks
thank
for
you so
having
much.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
thank
Adrian.
you.